They said the wolf had gone silent because it chose to. That the great black beast pacing the towers of Veldrath Keep had simply decided, one winter 60 years ago, that the world was no longer worth answering. The court accepted this. It was easier than the truth. The truth was that the Alpha King had stopped singing to it, had stopped being the kind of man who could. She was a keeper's daughter, a girl who carried old books through corridors no one else walked, who mixed dried herbs at a stone table in a room behind the lower kitchens, who had a voice she'd trained herself not to use in the presence of anyone who mattered. Her name was Mira. No one in the hall above her knew it. And then she hummed 3 notes she'd learned from her mother, standing alone in the dark beside a wolf's iron gate, and everything changed. If you want to know what it costs a woman to be heard by the only ears that matter, stay close. The year was the 431st year of the Veldrath line, the deepest winter anyone then living could remember. Snow had been falling since the harvest moon, and the roads from the north had been closed since the first frost of Ashfall. The keep sat on its black ridge like a seal pressed into wax, and inside its walls a hierarchy had calcified over 6 decades into something that moved only to crush whatever was too small to resist it. Mira had lived inside that hierarchy for 4 years, since the fever took her father and left her with his debts and his post and nothing else. She served in the archive room beneath the East Wing, cataloging the records of old treaties and older claims, a task no one wanted and therefore one she was assigned without ceremony or coin beyond her lodging. She was 22 years old. She wore her dark hair wrapped in a plain linen cloth to keep it from the dust of the shelves, and she moved through the lower passages of the keep like something the architecture had always held and never noticed. Her one deviation from the expected was the wolf. Every keeper who had preceded her in the archive post had learned on their first night to stay away from the east passage that ran below the tower. The iron gate at the passage's end was old, twice the height of a man, its bars thick as a wrist, and behind it the animal that lived in the tower's base could be heard in the dark. Not heard howling, heard breathing, heard pacing, its claws on the stone, a slow rhythm that had not varied in 6 decades. The court wolves that patrolled the yard were large and trained and handled by wolf masters with silver-tipped rods. They answered to rank and to force. The wolf behind the iron gate answered to nothing. It had not made a sound, her predecessor had told her, since the reign of the king before the king. Mira had passed the gate on her 3rd night. She had stopped, not from courage, but because her lamp had flickered in the draught, and she'd needed a moment to shield it, and in that moment she had heard the pacing stop. The weight of the silence behind the bars had been enormous, the way stone is enormous, the way winter sky is enormous, and before she could think better of it, she had hummed the first 3 notes of her mother's settling song, the one her mother had used to calm frightened animals in the yard of their cottage, before the cottage was sold and the yard was someone else's, the one that moved lower than a voice usually moves, that lived below words, in the body. The wolf had pressed its muzzle to the bars. Mira had not touched it. She had only lowered her lamp and looked at it in the dim and let the 3 notes finish. Then she had gone back to her work. She had returned the next night, and the night after that. Her anchor in the keep was a woman named Pella, the head cook's assistant, 10 years older and broad-shouldered, and the first person who had spoken Mira's name in the week after her father's death, without attaching pity or instructions to it. Pella kept a jar of dried plum skins on the shelf above her hearth, and gave Mira one, without comment, every morning when Mira came up from the archive passage before the hall stirred. It was not a large thing. It was the only reliable warmth in the building, and Mira had learned not to undervalue it. They did not speak much in the early months, beyond the transaction of the plum skin and the brief exchange of what was needed from the stores that day, and whether the upper hall's orders had changed. But Pella always looked at her when she came in, fully and without the sliding glance that most of the keep staff had developed for the lower servants. the glance that assessed and moved on without recording anything. Pella looked at Mira as if she were worth noting. It had the same effect as the plum skin, quiet and persistent, and not nothing. Pella knew about the wolf. "You're going to get yourself dismissed," Pella said. The morning Mira came in with a scrape along her palm from the iron bar where she had finally let the wolf's nose touch her hand. Or eaten. Or both. In that order. "It hasn't bitten me," Mira said. "Yet," Pella said, and placed the dried plum skin in Mira's hand with a firmness that meant she was frightened and would not say so. She had heard the old stories, the ones the kitchen staff traded in the late evenings when the fires were banked and the upper hall was asleep. The wolf that had brought down 3 armed men when Aldrich's grandfather was still king. The wolf that had not eaten for 6 months after the king before Aldrich died and had to be fed through the bars with a pole. The wolf that had not made a sound in 60 years and whose silence the court had learned to treat as ordinary. Pella did not believe in ordinary silences. She believed in silences that were holding something, and she had worked in this kitchen long enough to know the difference. What neither of them knew was that the wolf had been seen. Not by a servant, not by a stable hand. The king of Veldrath had not descended to the East Passage in 11 years. He had stopped going because there was nothing to be gained there. No relief, no recognition, no response. The wolf was his in the way that a scar is a man's, not because he chose it but because it had happened to him and could not be undone. His name was Aldrich. He was 39 years old, which was young for a king and old for a man who had been ruling since the age of 17 and had not slept a full night in 6 of the last 11 years. He wore the circlet as he wore everything, without decoration or softness, a band of dark iron that sat flush against his temple and left a faint pale line in the skin when he removed it. He had removed it twice in the last decade, both times alone. His face was not the face the court painters had managed to render correctly. They gave him proportion where he had asymmetry, gave him smoothness where his jaw carried the ridge of an old break that had healed slightly wrong, gave him the arranged features of a man who sat for portraits when in fact he had never sat for any of them voluntarily. What the painters could not reproduce was the quality of his stillness, the way a room organized itself around him without his doing anything to cause it, the way even men who did not like him tended to know exactly where in the room he was at every moment. He had descended on that particular night because he had been unable to sleep, and the courtyard was watched, and the only place in the keep with no courtier attached was the East Passage at the second bell. He had stood in the shadow of the passage's end and watched a girl in a linen head wrap crouch beside the iron gate and press her palm against the bars. He had watched the wolf press back. He had not moved. He had not spoken. He had stood very still with one hand on the cold passage wall and felt something tighten in his chest that he had not felt in a long time and could not name. He had gone back upstairs before she turned around. The court moved the way courts move, on currency of favor and position, and the currency in Veldrath's court circulated almost entirely through one man. Lord Castan held the post of High Steward, a title his family had held for 4 generations, which was long enough that the post had stopped feeling like a delegation and started feeling like an inheritance. He was 54, lean as rope, with a face that gave nothing away and eyes that worked constantly, noting entrances and exits, the placement of guards, the direction of a king's gaze. He had managed the keep's domestic administration for 20 years and had very firm ideas about which people belonged in which rooms. He did not know Mira's name. He knew her father's debts, which he had personally arranged to ensure the archive post remained filled with someone too beholden to ask questions. The first time Castan saw Mira, which was to say the first time his attention settled on her, was at the midwinter assembly in the Great Hall, where the court and its dependencies gathered annually to reaffirm the line's precedents. Mira had no business at the assembly. She had been asked to carry a ledger of old clan claims to the hall table for reference, a task that took less time than the walk there, and she should have been invisible. She was not invisible, because the wolf had followed her. Not physically. The wolf was behind its iron gate. What followed her was something else. A quality of attention in the room, a stillness among the assembled court wolves that had nothing to do with their handler's commands, and then, from somewhere in the stone above, a single sustained note that had not been heard in 60 years. Deep, unmistakable. Not a howl of threat or challenge. Something older. The great hall went silent in a way it had never gone silent in Mira's 4 years at the keep. Caston, standing at the king's left, turned not toward the ceiling but toward the girl by the ledger table. His expression did not change. His eyes did. Aldrich, seated at the dais, had gone very still, in the way a man goes still when something inside him stops arguing with itself. He did not look at Mira immediately. He looked at the walls. He looked at his hands. Then, slowly, in a room full of people who would speak of this night for the rest of their lives, he looked across the hall at the girl who was pretending she had nothing to do with any of it. "Who is she?" he said, quietly, to no one in particular. Caston answered before anyone else could. "The archive keeper's replacement, my lord, of no significance." The king said nothing. He returned his attention to the assembly. The wolf fell silent in the tower above. Mira did not look up. She gathered her ledger and walked from the hall with her spine straight and her face composed, and she did not allow herself to understand what had just happened until she was in the passage below, and her legs were no longer reliable. Pella was waiting at the kitchen threshold. She had heard the howl. So had everyone in the keep. "You should have told me it was that bad," she said. "I didn't know," Mira said. This was almost true. She returned to the gate that night, as she did every night, and the wolf was there before she reached the bars. It stood with its enormous head low and its amber eyes on her face, and when she hummed the first note it exhaled in a long, slow breath that fogged in the cold between them. She pressed her palm to the bar. The wolf's fur was thick and warm against the iron, and she felt the contact as something that moved through the bone of her hand and up her arm, and she understood that she had been feeling it this way for weeks, and choosing not to think about what it meant. What she had not yet understood was the shape of what it meant for the king. If you've ever wondered what it is that makes a silent thing finally speak, leave a thought below. Or stay. The answer is here. Aldrich sent for her 3 days after the assembly, through the Beta Warwick, his shadow guard, who delivered the summons in 4 words, said without inflection and without eye contact, as if the words were self-evidently reasonable. "The king will speak to you." Mira had been in the middle of reshelving a box of border claim documents from the reign of Aldrich's grandfather. She had set the box down carefully. She had followed Warwick up 3 flights of stairs she had never climbed. The 3rd flight was narrower than the others, the stone worn in the center from generations of feet, and the landings between flights had arrow-slit windows that showed the courtyard far below, the packed snow in the yard, the court wolves moving in their patrol lines, everything ordered and observed. She noted it the way she noted everything in the keep, not for use, but for the simple discipline of knowing what surrounded her. The room the king used when he did not want to be in the throne room was a small one, high in the keep's east wing, with 1 narrow window and a hearth barely larger than a kitchen hearth. Aldrich was standing when she entered, which she had not expected. He was taller than she had registered in the great hall, and broader, and he was wearing no visible mark of rank beyond the iron circlet. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking, in the manner of a man assembling words he had not had occasion to use. "You've been visiting the East Passage," he said. "Yes, my lord." "How long?" 4 years. Since my first week in the post." Something moved across his face and was carefully put away. "The wolf has not answered anyone in 60 years, he said. "It answered on the 3rd night," she said, I didn't know that was unusual. She had not meant it as a rebuke. She heard, in the silence that followed, that it had landed as one, and she was about to qualify it when he said, very quietly, "My grandfather could move it. My father could not. I have tried for 22 years. The fire made a sound in the grate. She watched him look at the narrow window as if he were measuring the distance between himself and something he could not name. "What do you do?" he asked. "When you go there?" "I hum," she said. "A settling song my mother taught me, for frightened animals." She watched the word frightened land in him. He did not flinch. He absorbed it. "Come back tomorrow night," he said. "I will be there." He came back 4 nights in a row, standing in the far passage while she crouched at the gate, and he said nothing on any of those nights, and she did not acknowledge him, and the wolf stood against the bars with its great head pressed to the iron and its amber eyes on her face the entire time. She was aware of him in the way she was aware of heat from a fire at the edge of vision, a warmth that had no source she was willing to name, and she kept her attention on the wolf because the wolf was what she understood. On the second night, she heard him shift his weight in the dark behind her, and her hands tightened slightly on the bar and she made them ease. On the third night, she heard him exhale and recognized, in the quality of the sound, that he was not standing 2 yards back as he had been. He was closer. She did not turn. The wolf noticed. Its amber eyes moved briefly from her face to the point over her shoulder where the king stood, and then back to her. And she felt in that exchange something she could not account for, as if the wolf had looked at both of them and arrived at a conclusion it was content to hold. On the 5th night he moved forward and stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the cold air shift. She did not move. The wolf looked at both of them. "It knows you're here," she said. "It always knew I was here," Aldrich said. His voice in the passage was lower than it was in the formal room, less controlled, as if the stone absorbed something the court ceilings could not. "That was never the problem." "What was the problem?" she asked. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he would not answer. Then, quiet. "I stopped being someone worth answering." The deniable crack. The one she filed away as simple confidence or simple honesty, as something powerful men said when they were not watching what they revealed. She did not understand it as an opening. She was not watching for openings. She was watching the wolf, which had turned its amber gaze from her to the king for the first time in 4 years of her visits. Caston moved faster than she realized. She learned the shape of his interference in pieces, the way you learn the shape of a trap after you are inside it. The first piece arrived through Pella, who came to the archive room 11 days after the king's first visit to the gate, with a bruise at her wrist she had covered with her sleeve, and a practiced look of calm that did not extend past her mouth. Caston had spoken to her about the archive keeper. The conversation had included the suggestion that certain domestic posts were reviewed at midwinter, and that those reviews were often influenced by the impressions of senior staff. Pella had kept her voice even and her hands still, while Mira told her this was not Pella's problem to carry, and then Pella had said, with the exhaustion of someone who had watched this keep run for 15 years, "He keeps lists, Mira. He has always kept lists." The second piece arrived the same night, overheard through the half-open door of the great hall's side corridor. Caston and a man she did not recognize, a heavy-shouldered elder in deep green robes whom she would later learn was Lord Savan, one of 2 allied clan heads who had been petitioning for Aldrich's formal alliance for a decade. Their voices were low, but the passage was stone, and stone carries. "The girl disrupts the precedents," Caston said. "The king has not moved toward a bond in 22 years, Savan said. "He will not move toward this one. I will see to it." "You have said that before, Castan." "I have not had this particular lever before." Mira pressed herself against the passage wall and understood that the wolf's answering had been noted by everyone who needed to note it, and that Castan's lists were now about her specifically, and that whatever he meant by This particular lever was something she did not yet know and therefore could not defend against. The lever was silver. Not silver as a common material. Silver as the old Pax sacrament, the ash veil, a ritual of sundering used in the early centuries to dissolve claimed bonds that had been declared false by a high steward acting in the king's name. The ash veil required a sealed cloth soaked in silver water and pressed to the claimed one's marked skin, burning the mark away. It had not been performed in 160 years. It did not require the king's presence. It required only the high steward's written order, confirmed by 2 clan witness signatures, and a formal declaration that the bond was fabricated or coerced. Mira did not bear a mark. She had not been claimed. What Caston intended was to use the threat of an ash veil proceeding to classify her proximity to the wolf and to the king as a calculated deception, and on the basis of that classification, to remove her from the keep permanently and without appeal. He had the signatures. He had obtained Sivan's by the end of the midwinter assembly night. He had obtained the second from Lord Farath, the keep's second elder, who had no strong feeling about the matter and several strong feelings about the debts Caston had quietly been collecting on his behalf for 3 years. The order was written. The date was set. The first morning after the long dark. The sacred 3-day period in deep winter when no court proceedings were customarily held, a timing that would ensure no appeal could be filed before the proceeding was complete. Mira found this out from a source she had not expected. Beta Warwick had not been asked by anyone to warn her. He had come to the archive room on the second night of the long dark and stood in the doorway without entering and said, in the same uninflected voice he used for everything, "The order has been filed. The morning after next." He paused. "The king has not been told." "Why hasn't he been told?" she asked. "Because the mechanism does not require his knowledge," Warwick said. "That is why Caston chose it." He left without saying anything else. She sat with the information for a long time in the cold archive room, the shelves of old documents around her, her lamp casting its small circle, the distant sound of the wolf in the passage below, pacing its familiar rhythm. 4 years of nights. It had not howled again since the assembly. She had not expected it to. She had not been humming to make it howl. She had been humming because it was the only living thing in the keep that listened without requiring anything from her in return. She got up. She took her cloak from the hook behind the door. She went to find Pella. Pella was in the kitchen, as she always was, alone at the late hour. The fire banked low, a kettle on the chain. She looked at Mira's face and said nothing. She poured a cup and set it on the table. Mira sat down and said, without preamble, "The ash veil. Can the king stop it once the order is filed?" Pella was quiet for a long time. "If he acts before the proceeding begins," she said. "If he makes a formal counterclaim before the first bell of the following morning." "Does he know the order exists?" "No," Mira said. Pella looked at her for a long moment. "You could tell him," she said. "I could," Mira said. "Or I could do something that doesn't depend on him." What she could do, because she had spent 4 years in the archive room and had read everything in it that was not locked, was find the original Ashvale proceedings from the keep's records and confirm what she had begun to suspect since Warwick's visit. The ash veil could not be applied to an unclaimed person. It required a prior mark. Caston's order, if it had been filed without this requirement met, was invalid on its face. The document she needed was in the sealed box on the 3rd shelf from the top, in the archive room's inner alcove. The box she had noted 14 months ago, and not touched, because it was sealed with the old clan wax that was not her business. She had the key to the archive room. She did not have the key to the sealed box. The key to the sealed box was in the keep's senior records room, 3 floors up, in a locked drawer in a desk that belonged to Caston. She had no reason to be in the senior records room. She had no key to the locked drawer. What she had was 4 years of moving through the keep's lower passages at hours when no one watched, and a knowledge of the keep's architecture that came from reading everything in the archive room, including the original floor plan documents of the East Wing renovation 40 years prior, which showed a service corridor that ran behind the senior records room's east wall and connected to a cold storage passage whose door was never locked because no one went there in winter. It was the long dark. The keep's formal schedule was suspended. The corridors were quiet. She went up. The service corridor behind the senior records room was exactly where the floor plan document had shown it, a passage barely shoulder wide, stone sweating with cold, lit by no lamp. She moved through it by touch, one hand on the wall, and found the connecting door to the cold storage passage by the change in air and the faint draft of a room that connected to the outer wall. The door opened without resistance. The cold storage passage itself was empty, as it would be all winter. The stone shelves bare, the hook for the keeper's lamp empty. The connecting door to the records room was wood, old, with a gap at the base wide enough that the lamplight from the records room proper would have shone through if there had been any. There was none. She opened the door and stood in the dark records room, with the cold radiating off the floor through her boots and the shapes of the heavy desks around her, and she found Caston's desk by its position against the room's north wall, the largest in the room, the one with 3 drawers on the right side. She had seen it once, in passing, 2 years prior, when she had been sent to deliver a misdirected envelope from the archive. The drawer lock was simpler than she had expected. She had brought a thin iron stylus from the archive room, the kind used for pressing seals, and she worked it in the dark for 8 minutes before the mechanism gave. She took the key. She went back down. She opened the sealed box with hands that had steadied themselves, not out of courage, but out of the understanding that there was no version of the next 12 hours that she survived by being frightened. And she read the original Ashvale Charter in its entirety by lamplight at the archive table. She was right. The procedure required a confirmed mark, a bond formally acknowledged. Caston had filed his order against an unclaimed woman, which made the proceeding not merely unjust but structurally void. She made a copy of the relevant section. She sealed it with the archive's own wax, which she was authorized to use. She wrote the citation of the flaw in clear letters at the bottom of the page, because she had not spent 4 years reading records to write illegibly, and then she rolled the document and held it in her lap for a long moment while the fire made small sounds in the grate. She could take this to a magistrate. The keep had a magistrate, an elderly man named Gort, who had held the post for 30 years and was widely understood to do what the High Steward suggested. She could take it to the king. She could take it to no one and simply present it at the proceedings' commencement, when the challenge would be public and on record and harder to ignore. She chose the third option, not for herself, for the record. On the morning after the long dark, the first bell had barely faded when the clan assembly gathered in the great hall for the proceeding. It was not a large assembly by the keep's standards. 9 witnesses, Caston and his 2 clan heads, Magistrate Gort at his table, 3 senior household staff called as observers. Mira was escorted in by a keep guard who had the decency to look uncomfortable about his assignment. She had worn her plain gray tunic and her linen head wrap, and she carried the rolled document under her arm, and she stood where they put her, at the center of the hall's stone floor, and waited. Caston read the order in the formal voice he used for occasions he wanted to feel inevitable. He had not looked at her when she entered. He looked at her now, briefly, with the expression of a man who has checked all his corners and found them clear. The archive keeper is accused of fabricating proximity to the bonding mechanism of this keep's ward, the Great Wolf of Veldrath, for the purpose of gaining false standing before the crown, he said. The remedy is Ashvale severance and permanent removal from the keep's service. Magistrate Gort opened his mouth. The proceeding is void, Mira said. Her voice in the stone hall was exactly as loud as it needed to be, not louder. Caston's expression did not change. "You will wait to be addressed," he said. "I am presenting a structural challenge to the proceedings' validity," she said. She unrolled the document and set it on the nearest table, face up. The Ashvale Charter, copied from the archive records of the 402nd year of the Veldrath line, Section 3, Clause 7. The procedure requires a confirmed mark on the challenged party. I bear no mark. The order is invalid. The hall was quiet enough that she could hear the fire in the back hearth. Caston turned to Gort. "This is a distraction," he said. "The challenge is procedurally irregular." Gort had picked up the document. He was reading it with the slow care of a man who had always preferred correct procedure to convenient procedure, which was the one quality that had sustained his post through 4 decades and 2 kings. His eyes moved to the bottom of the page, where the citation was written clearly in her hand. He set the document down. "It's valid," he said. The weight of what Caston was about to say next was legible in his posture. The hall had 9 witnesses. He had 2 signed clan heads and a magistrate, and a guard. And the guard was holding the door, and the order was prepared, and the long dark was finished, and his window was closing. He calculated all of this in the 2 seconds before he opened his mouth. The door opened. Not the door the guard was holding. The far door. The great hall's main entrance from the yard, which was heavy oak on iron hinges and which swung inward with the sound of the yard behind it. Cold air and the sound of wolves, a dozen of the court pack surging in ahead of their master, and ranging along the hall's edges in perfect formation, and then the king, crossing the threshold with Warwick at his left, and the circlet on his brow and the particular stillness of a man who has been running and has decided not to show it. Aldrich had not been asleep when Warwick reached him. He had been at the east passage gate, alone, standing in the dark beside the bars as he had been doing every night for the past weeks, trying to learn what the girl had known since her first week in the keep. Warwick had told him everything in the passage, quickly, and he had listened without interrupting and then said 4 words. "How far has it gone?" And Warwick had said, "The hall in 20 minutes." And Aldrich had said nothing else, had simply moved. He crossed the hall in silence. He looked at Caston. He looked at the document on the table, at Gort, at the 2 clan heads whose signatures were on the order. He looked at Mira last, and it was not a brief look. It was the look of a man confirming something he had not yet said aloud. "She found the flaw herself," Warwick said quietly, to no one in particular. Aldrich turned to Caston. "You filed an Ashvale order against an unclaimed person," he said. "On what authority?" Caston's voice, when it came, had the careful tone of a man who believed he was still in a recoverable position. "On the authority of the High Steward's Charter, which grants administrative discretion to remove elements that destabilize the keep's social hierarchy." The wolf's response constitutes a formal bond signal, which means the proximity is classified as a pending claim. The Ashvale was the appropriate remedy. "A pending claim," Aldrich said. "Yes, my lord." "Then it is my claim," Aldrich said, "and not yours to sever." The hall was entirely still. Caston took a breath. "My lord, the court's stability, the precedence of the line. 22 years without a bond means the succession question has been open for 22 years, and it cannot be answered by an archive keeper with no blood and no rank." "The wolf answered her," Aldrich said. "For the first time in 60 years. "With respect," Caston said, his voice hardening now. "The wolf is an animal." "The wolf," Aldrich said, "has never been wrong." He turned away from Caston then, which was its own declaration, and he walked to where Mira stood. He stood before her for a moment, close, and she could feel the cold of the yard still on him, and the controlled force of everything he had been holding while he walked across the hall, and her hands were very still at her sides, and she looked at him directly because she was not going to look anywhere else. "I have kept it silent for 22 years, he said, low, so the hall could just barely carry it. "I did not know what I had stopped being." He paused. "You knew, in 3 notes, before you knew anything else about this place." He reached out and took her right hand. He held it for a moment, palm up, and then placed it against his chest where the circlet's line met his collar, over the mark beneath the cloth, the king's mark that had not been pressed against another living person in 22 years, and the warmth that came through was immediate and unmistakable, and ran up her arm and into her chest, and the hall saw it, the light at her fingers, faint gold against the stone, and the assembly saw it, and not one person in the room looked away. From the east tower, through the stone, through the keep's winter walls, the wolf spoke. It was not a howl of triumph. It was long and steady and low, the sound of something vast and patient that had been waiting for the world to catch up, and it filled the great hall from floor to ceiling, and the court wolves along the walls folded themselves to the stone without a sound, and Sivan, who was 58 years old and had served 3 kings, sat down heavily in the nearest chair because his knees had decided the matter for him, and Ferath followed a moment later, and then Gort, and then the guard at the door, and Castan was the last one standing, alone in the center of a hall that had gone to its knees, and he stood there for 4 seconds with the expression of a man watching the mathematics of his life revise themselves beyond recovery. Aldrich did not look at him. He was looking at Mira. "You are mine," he said. A short, total sentence, unelaborated, and she heard in it not the demand she would have heard from another man's mouth, but the confession she had been waiting, without knowing it, to receive. "Every night at the gate, you have been more patient with this place than it has deserved." Castan was removed from the high stewardship before the first bell of the afternoon. Sivan and Ferath both submitted written recantations of their witness signatures before evening, which Gort received and recorded with the particular satisfaction of a man who had spent 30 years wishing someone would give him a clear case. The sealed order was voided. The copy Mira had made went into the archive's permanent record, alongside the Ashvale charter she had copied, because she had a strong feeling about leaving clean documentation behind. Pella heard about it before the midday meal. She was in the kitchen when Mira came in, and she looked at Mira's face and at the faint gold mark that had not fully faded from her palm, and she set the jar of dried plum skins on the table and said, without ceremony, "You'll want one of those." "I'll want several," Mira said. She went down to the East Passage that evening, not from habit but because she wanted to, and the wolf was at the bars, and its amber eyes were steady, and it pressed its forehead against the iron when she reached the gate. She did not hum this time. She simply stood with her hand on the bar and let the warmth of the contact move through her, as it always had, and after a moment she heard the footstep behind her, and she did not need to turn to know who it was. Aldrich stood beside her. His hand came to the bar next to hers, not touching, close enough that she felt the warmth of him in the cold passage. They stood like that for a long time, the wolf's breath fogging the air between the bars, the keep quiet above them. 60 years of silence already receding into the stone it had come from. "It will want a larger gate," he said. "Yes," she said. His fingers moved along the bar and came to rest over hers. The wolf exhaled once, slow and steady, and closed its amber eyes,